He thought the road belonged to him. Until the night the road answered back. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the Texas darkness like a blade, painting the empty highway in pulses of authority and silence. The kind of silence that made people grip their steering wheels just a little tighter when they saw those lights in their rearview mirror. Because out here, miles away from the nearest town, there were no witnesses, no second opinions, just the law and whoever claimed to represent it. And for years, that law had a name: Daniel Hayes, a Texas highway officer who had built a reputation that didn't exist on paper but lived in whispers, in gas station conversations, in quiet warnings passed between drivers who knew better than to argue, because arguing meant trouble, and trouble meant time, money, and consequences no one could afford, especially not on a long stretch of asphalt where the only sound at night was the wind brushing across dry land and the distant hum of engines passing through like ghosts. Hayes stood beside his patrol car now, one hand resting casually near his belt, the other adjusting the brim of his hat as he watched another set of headlights approach in the distance, steady, calm, unaware, the way they always were. And for a moment, everything felt routine, predictable, like every other night that had come before it, nights where he pulled people over, asked questions that weren't really questions, made suggestions that weren't really optional, and walked away with more than just a warning issued, because out here, power didn't need permission, it just needed opportunity, and opportunity always came rolling down that highway one driver at a time. The car slowed as his lights signaled it to pull over, tires crunching softly against gravel as it came to a stop on the shoulder, engine idling, headlights still cutting forward into the darkness as if trying to escape what had already begun. Hayes took a slow breath, the kind that carried years of habit, years of knowing exactly how this would play out. He stepped forward, boots hitting the ground with quiet certainty, each step measured, controlled, the way someone walks when they believe nothing can challenge them, when the system has never once pushed back. And inside the car, behind the wheel, sat Angela Brooks, her hands resting lightly, her posture straight, her expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She didn't fumble for anything, didn't reach, didn't panic. She simply waited. And there was something about that stillness, something almost too calm, that didn't match the countless other drivers Hayes had stopped before. But habits are louder than instincts, and Hayes ignored it, just like he had ignored every small doubt that ever tried to surface over the years. He tapped lightly on the window, the sound sharp, against the quiet night, and when the glass rolled down, the air between them shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that if someone had been standing close enough, they might have felt it, the beginning of something that didn't belong to routine, license and registration. He said, his voice steady, controlled, carrying the weight of authority without needing to raise itself. Angela met his eyes, calm, direct, no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet presence that lingered longer than expected. And for a fraction of a second, Hayes felt it, that subtle resistance, not in her actions, but in her silence. The kind of silence that doesn't submit, that doesn't shrink, that simply exists, unbothered. And it unsettled something deep beneath his practiced confidence. But only for a moment, because moments like that get buried quickly when you've spent years believing you are untouchable. He shifted slightly, glancing at the interior of the car, scanning, assessing, already preparing his next move, the familiar script forming in his mind, the same one that had worked over and over again. But what he didn't see, what he didn't know, was that this stop wasn't just another name on a long list of drivers who would leave feeling smaller than when they arrived. This wasn't another quiet exchange that would disappear into the night without consequence, because Angela Brooks hadn't ended up on this road by accident, and the stillness she carried wasn't uncertainty, it was control, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that waits, patiently, for the exact moment when everything changes. And as the wind moved softly across the open land, carrying the faint scent of dust and distance, the highway stretched on into darkness ahead of them, empty, silent, watching, as if even the road itself knew that this stop, this moment, this ordinary exchange between a man who thought he owned the night and a woman who had said nothing at all, was about to become something neither of them could walk away from the same way again. The moment lingered longer than it should have, stretching thin between the hum of the engine and the quiet rhythm of the wind brushing across the open Texas land. And Daniel Hayes could feel it, that subtle shift that did not belong in his routine, the kind of pause that made the night feel heavier than usual. But instead of stepping back, he leaned into it, because for years leaning in had always worked. For years it had always ended the same way, with him walking away in control, and so he straightened his posture slightly, letting authority settle back into his voice as he repeated, slower this time, license and registration. As if the repetition itself would re-establish the balance he was used to, Angela Brooks did not rush. She did not fumble. She reached calmly into her bag, her movements precise, deliberate, almost measured in a way that felt intentional rather than nervous. And that difference did not go unnoticed, not entirely. Because Hayes had seen fear before, he knew what it looked like, the trembling hands, the quick apologies, the rushed explanations. And this was not that. This was something else, something quieter, something that did not ask for permission. And when she handed over the documents, her fingers steady, her eyes still meeting his without challenge yet without submission, Hayes took them with a slight pause, glancing down, scanning the name, the address, the details that usually told him everything he needed to know, but this time they told him nothing, just ordinary information printed on a piece of plastic, nothing that explained the comms sitting in front of him, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. So he shifted again, clearing his throat lightly, adding a layer of suspicion to his tone. Do you know why I pulled you over tonight? It was not a real question. It never was. It was part of the script, part of the pressure, the setup that led to the moment where people started to second-guess themselves, where they started to cooperate beyond what was required. But Angela did not follow the script. She did not guess. She did not apologize. She simply said, "No, officer, I do not." Her voice even, respectful, but firm in a way that did not bend. And that small refusal to fill in the silence, to play along, created a gap that Hayes could not easily close, the kind of gap that made control feel just slightly out of reach. And for a brief second, the night seemed to hold its breath with him, waiting to see which direction this would go. Hayes glanced back toward his patrol car, toward the flashing lights that had always been enough to remind people where they stood, and then back at her, deciding to move forward, because stopping now would mean acknowledging something he was not ready to name. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, the words firm but not raised, controlled but unmistakable, the kind of instruction that usually ended hesitation before it began. And Angela paused, just for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but as if considering the moment itself, as if weighing something unseen. And then she complied, opening the door slowly, stepping out onto the gravel shoulder, the cool night air brushing against her as she stood beside the car, the highway stretching endlessly behind her. And for the first time, Hayes noticed the way she positioned herself, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, grounded, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming next. And that acceptance, that quiet steadiness, made something inside him tighten, because it did not match the outcome he expected. It did not fit into the pattern he had repeated for years. And yet he continued, because patterns are hard to break when they have never failed you. "I'm going to take a quick look inside your vehicle," he added, watching for the reaction that usually followed, the hesitation, the concern, the unspoken agreement that often came with it. But again, Angela did not react the way others had. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply looked at him, calm, unwavering, and said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And it was not the words themselves that caught him off guard. It was the way she said them, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a statement, quiet and certain, like someone who already knew the answer to a question he had not fully asked. And for the first time that night, Daniel Hayes felt something unfamiliar settle into the space between them, not fear, not doubt, but the faint, undeniable sense that this stop, this ordinary moment on an empty Texas highway, was no longer under his control. The air seemed to tighten around them after she said it. Not louder, not sharper, just heavier, like the kind of silence that presses against your ears before a storm you did not see coming. And Daniel Hayes stood there for a moment longer than he intended, her words settling into his mind in a way that did not quite make sense, because people did not usually ask that question, not like that, not with that calm certainty. They either complied or they resisted, They either spoke too much or not at all. But this was different, and different had never been part of his routine. So he responded the only way he knew how, by doubling down on control. Step back from the vehicle, he said, his tone firm, measured, but carrying a faint edge now, the kind that appears when confidence is no longer automatic. Angela did not move immediately, not out of defiance, but as if she was allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to. Then she took a single step back, her eyes never leaving him, steady, observant. And Hayes turned toward the car, reaching for the door handle, his fingers pausing for just a fraction of a second before pulling it open. The interior light flickering on, illuminating the seats, the dashboard, the quiet, ordinary details of a vehicle that looked like any other on the road. And yet something about it felt staged, not in appearance, but in presence. Like every object inside had a purpose beyond what it seemed, and Hayes brushed that thought aside. Quickly, stepping closer, leaning slightly as he began his inspection, his movements practiced, routine, but his focus sharper than before, scanning the compartments, the seats, the floor, searching not just for something physical, but for something that would restore the balance he felt slipping. Behind him, Angela remained still, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, as if she had done this before, as if she knew exactly how long this would take, exactly what he would do next, and that knowledge, even unspoken, lingered in the space between them. Hayes reached toward the center console, his hand hovering for a brief second before opening it, expecting the usual clutter, the small signs of a normal life. But instead he found something else, not dramatic, not obvious, just a small, neatly placed device, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And he froze, not visibly, not in a way that would give anything away, but internally, something shifted, because this was not random, this was not accidental, this was placed, intentional. And for the first time that night, a question formed in his mind that he could not immediately answer. He straightened slowly, turning his head slightly, glancing back toward Angela, who was still standing there, calm, composed, watching, not nervously, not anxiously, but with a quiet patience that now felt less like confidence and more like certainty. And that was when it began to settle in, not all at once, not clearly, but enough to disturb the foundation he had built over years of unchecked control. He stepped back from the car, closing the door. With a softer motion than before, his mind moving quickly now, retracing the steps, the words, the timing, searching for something he might have missed, something that would explain why this moment felt different, why this stop did not feel like the others. "What is that device in your console?" he asked, his voice controlled, but no longer as effortless as it had been minutes earlier. Angela tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question, and for the first time since he had approached the vehicle, there was the faintest hint of something else in her expression, not amusement, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. "You already know what it is," she said quietly, and those words did not raise her voice, did not change her tone, but they landed with a weight that echoed louder than anything else that had been said that night. And in that instant, standing on the side of a quiet Texas highway with the lights still flashing behind him and the open road stretching endlessly ahead, Daniel Hayes felt it clearly, the shift he had tried to ignore, the realization that this was no longer his stop, no longer his script, no longer his control, because whatever this moment was, it had been set long before he ever turned on those lights. The words lingered in the air long after she said them, not because they were loud, but because they carried a certainty that could not be ignored, and Daniel Hayes felt it settle into his chest like something heavy and unfamiliar, the kind of feeling he had spent years avoiding by staying in control, by never letting a moment slip beyond his reach. But now that control felt thinner, less certain, like a surface beginning to crack under pressure he did not yet understand. He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain that familiar authority, trying to force the moment back into something he could manage. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice firmer now, sharper, as if the strength of his tone alone could re-establish the balance. But Angela Brooks did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, unhurried, as though time itself had slowed around her while everything inside him was starting to move faster. And then she spoke, calm and measured, that device has been recording since before you stepped out of your car. And there it was, not dramatic, not explosive, just a simple truth placed directly between them. And in that instant, something inside Hayes shifted in a way that could not be undone, because recording meant evidence, and evidence meant accountability, two things that had never existed on this stretch of road, not for him, not in the way they did now. He glanced instinctively toward the empty highway, toward the darkness that had always protected him, but tonight it felt different, less like a shield and more like a witness, silent but present, stretching for miles in every direction. And he realized something else, something that made his grip tighten slightly at his side. This was not just about a single moment, not just about what he had done tonight. This reached further back, further than he had ever allowed himself to think about. Angela took a small step forward, not closing the distance aggressively, just enough to shift the space between them. And for the first time, she spoke with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. For the past 2 years, multiple complaints have been filed about traffic stops along this highway, she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a weight that matched the gravity of her words. Patterns of behavior, consistent reports, missing cash, undocumented searches. Each phrase landed carefully, deliberately, like pieces of a puzzle being placed in front of him one by one. And Hayes felt his thoughts begin to race, not outwardly, not in panic, but internally, searching, calculating, trying to find the angle that would make this stop no different than the others. But there was no angle, no familiar path forward, because this was not random, this was not a coincidence. This was planned. You are saying this is some kind of setup, he replied, his voice controlled but tighter now, the ease gone, replaced by something closer to strain. Angela did not react to the shift in his tone. She did not mirror it. She did not escalate. She simply answered, I am saying this is documentation. And that word carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, because documentation meant this moment was not isolated. It was connected, part of something larger, something that extended beyond this road, beyond this night, beyond him. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued to pulse behind them, but now they felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a spotlight, exposing rather than protecting. And Hayes became aware of something he had not considered before, the possibility that this moment was not just being witnessed by her, but by others, unseen, waiting, watching. He turned slightly, scanning the distance, the empty stretch of highway that no longer felt empty. And for the first time in years, Daniel Hayes was not certain of what would happen next, because for the first time, the script had changed, and he was no longer the one writing it. The word documentation did not echo. It settled, heavy and immovable, like something that had already been decided long before this moment ever began. And Daniel Hayes felt it in the way his breath slowed, not from calm, but from calculation, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you no longer feels solid, when every instinct that once guided you forward now pauses, uncertain, searching for a path that no longer exists. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing once more down the empty highway, but the emptiness did not comfort him anymore. It watched him, it held him there, and for the first time in years, the silence did not belong to him. You are making a serious accusation, he said, his voice controlled. Careful now. Each word placed with intention as if precision could restore control, but Angela Brooks did not react to the weight of his statement. She did not step back, did not soften. She simply stood there, grounded, her presence unwavering in a way that made the flashing lights behind him feel distant, almost irrelevant. No, she replied quietly. I am stating a recorded pattern, and again, it was not the volume of her voice that carried power, it was the certainty within it, the absence of doubt, the absence of fear, and that absence was what unsettled him most, because fear had always been part of the equation. Fear had always made things easier, faster, predictable, but without it, the equation no longer worked, and Hayes could feel that shift clearly now. He exhaled slowly, forcing a small nod, as if acknowledging something he did not fully accept. People say a lot of things, he added, his tone slightly more defensive now, though still measured, still careful. Complaints do not prove anything. And for a brief moment, the night held still again, waiting, but Angela did not rush to respond. She let the silence sit between them, deliberate, intentional, as if giving his words space to reveal themselves for what they were. And then she spoke. "You are right," she said, and that agreement caught him off guard more than resistance would have. Because agreement was not part of the confrontation he expected, complaints alone do not prove anything. She continued, her eyes steady on his. "That is why evidence matters." And as she said it, she reached slowly toward her jacket, not quickly, not abruptly, just enough to signal intention without escalation, and Hayes felt his focus sharpen instantly. Every movement suddenly significant, every detail carrying weight. She pulled out a small identification wallet, holding it at a level where he could see it clearly, the badge catching a brief reflection from the flashing lights, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The highway, the wind, the distance, all of it fading into the background as that single detail came into focus, and Hayes felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition, the kind that arrives before understanding fully forms. "Angela Brooks," she said calmly. "Internal Affairs, Multi-State Oversight Division." And the words did not rush. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, precise and undeniable. And in that moment, the pattern became visible, not just the events of tonight, but the months, the years that had led to this exact point. Every stop, every decision, every moment he had assumed would disappear into the quiet of the night now connected to something far larger than himself. Hayes blinked once, slowly, his mind working to process what stood in front of him, to reconcile the image of the calm woman he had pulled over with the reality of the authority she now revealed, and for the first time, he understood that the control he believed he had never truly existed in the way he thought. It had only gone unchallenged, and now it had been. Completely, he straightened slightly, instinctively, as if posture alone could restore balance. But it did not, because the balance had already shifted, irreversibly. Angela lowered the identification but did not put it away, her gaze never leaving his. "This operation has been active for 6 months, she continued, her voice even, factual. Multiple vehicles, multiple recordings, coordinated timing. Each detail adding weight, building something he could not step away from. Tonight was not random," she finished, and those words removed any remaining doubt, any illusion of coincidence. And Hayes felt the full realization settle in, not all at once, but enough to understand what this moment truly was. Not a stop, not an interaction, but a conclusion, the end of something that had been building quietly, patiently, beyond his awareness. The flashing lights behind him continued their steady rhythm, but now they felt different, no longer a symbol of control, but a signal, a marker of a moment that would not disappear when the night ended. And as the wind moved again across the open Texas highway, carrying with it the faint sound of something approaching in the distance, Daniel Hayes realized something he had never considered before, that the road he believed belonged to him had been leading him here all along. The distant sound that had barely registered before began to grow, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, deliberate, like something that had been on its way long before either of them realized it mattered. And Daniel Hayes stood there, his posture still upright, still composed on the surface, but beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way he could no longer control, because this was no longer a moment he could steer, no longer a situation he could reshape with tone or presence or authority. This had moved beyond him, and he knew it, even if he had not fully accepted it yet. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, where faint headlights began to appear, small at first, almost indistinguishable from the countless cars that had passed through this highway over the years. But these did not pass, they approached, and they did so with purpose, closing the distance with a quiet certainty that mirrored the calm standing in front of him. Angela Brooks did not turn to look. She did not need to. Her attention remained on him, steady, grounded, as if everything unfolding now was exactly as expected, exactly as planned. "You should know," she said, her voice still even, still measured. This was never about one stop. And those words carried something deeper than explanation. They carried finality, the kind that does not ask for agreement, the kind that simply states what is already true. Hayes inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the strain he had been holding back, because now the pattern was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable, It had shape, it had direction, and it was moving toward him. The approaching headlights grew brighter, resolving into the outlines of multiple vehicles, their silhouettes unmistakable, not civilian, not random, and for a moment, the highway that had always felt empty now felt occupied, watched, accounted for. Hayes shifted his stance slightly, a subtle movement, almost instinctive, as if preparing for something he had not yet defined. But there was no preparation for this, not in the way he understood it, not in the way he had relied on for years. "You have made your point," he said, attempting to reclaim some measure of control through his words. But the effort felt thinner now, less convincing even to himself. Angela did not respond immediately. She allowed the sound of the approaching vehicles to fill the space between them, the growing hum of engines replacing the silence that had once belonged to him. And then she spoke. "This is where it changes," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, and the vehicles behind him slowed, their headlights casting long beams across the road, illuminating the scene in a way that left no shadows to hide in. Doors opened, figures stepped out, their movements coordinated, calm, professional, not rushed, not aggressive, just precise. And Hayes felt the full weight of the moment settle in, not as panic, not as fear, but as recognition. The kind that arrives when the last piece of a puzzle falls into place, and there is nothing left to question, nothing left to reinterpret. He turned slightly, just enough to take in the scene behind him, the presence of others now undeniable, their focus directed toward him, toward this moment, toward the end of something that had stretched across years without consequence. And then he looked back at Angela, really looked this time, not as a driver, not as a stop, but as the person she had been all along, someone who had stepped into this moment with intention, with preparation, with a certainty he had mistaken for something else. And in that look, something in him shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough to understand that whatever came next was no longer his to control. Angela took a small step forward, closing the distance just slightly, her presence calm, unwavering, and for the first time since the night began, her voice carried something more than quiet certainty. It carried conclusion. "Officer Hayes," she said, and the use of his name, spoken clearly, precisely, removed any remaining distance between who he had been and what he had become in this moment. Everything from this point forward is on record. And that sentence did not rise, did not fall. It settled, final and complete. And as the figures behind him moved closer, their presence filling the space that had once belonged only to him, Daniel Hayes stood on the side of that Texas highway and realized that the road he had controlled for so long had led him here, to a place where control no longer mattered, where routine no longer applied, where the silence he once relied on had been replaced by something far more powerful, the truth that had been building quietly, patiently, waiting for the exact moment to step into the light. The night no longer belonged to a single man standing beside a patrol car. It had expanded, widened, filled with presence, with purpose, with something that could not be pushed aside or redirected. And Daniel Hayes could feel it in the way the air itself seemed to change, no longer still, no longer silent, but active, aware, as if every inch of that highway had shifted from being his territory into something entirely different, something that now answered to a different authority. The figures who had stepped out of the approaching vehicles moved with quiet coordination, their footsteps measured against the gravel, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. This was not chaos. This was structure. This was order. The kind that does not need to raise its voice because it already knows its place. Hayes remained where he stood, his posture still upright, still composed in appearance. But the foundation beneath that composure had begun to erode, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something long ignored finally giving way under its own weight. He watched as one of the individuals approached, stopping just a few feet away, maintaining distance, maintaining control, everything about the movement precise, intentional. And Hayes understood in that moment that this was no longer about what he said or how he said it. This had moved beyond conversation, beyond influence, beyond the small adjustments he had relied on for years. Angela Brooks remained just to his side, her presence unchanged, her calm not wavering even as the scene expanded around them. Because for her, this was not escalation. This was completion, the final step in something that had already been built piece by piece long before this night. Officer Hayes, the approaching voice said, steady and professional, carrying the same controlled tone that Angela had used, a tone that did not need to assert itself because it already held authority, and Hayes turned slightly toward it, acknowledging without fully engaging, his mind still processing, still adjusting, still trying to reconcile the version of himself that had stood here countless times before with the reality unfolding now. You are going to step away from the vehicle. The voice continued, not as a demand, not as a threat, but as a directive, clear and unambiguous, and Hayes felt the weight of it settle into him, not as resistance, but as inevitability, because this was not a moment he could redirect, not a situation he could outmaneuver. This was something that had already been decided, already set into motion, and for the first time in years, he followed an instruction without shaping it to his advantage, without adjusting it to fit his control. He took a step back, then another, the gravel shifting beneath his boots, the distance between him and the car becoming symbolic in a way he could not ignore, a separation not just of space, but of authority, of identity, of everything he had believed defined him on this road. Angela watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with a calm recognition of what this moment represented, not for him, but for everyone who had passed through this highway before him, unseen, unheard, unrecorded. Until now, the lights from the additional vehicles cast a broader glow across the scene, illuminating details that had once been hidden by darkness, and Hayes became aware of how visible everything now was, how exposed, how undeniable. The highway stretched out in both directions, but it no longer felt like an escape, it felt like a record, a line that connected past actions to present consequences. The approaching individual stopped just ahead of him, maintaining that measured distance, maintaining that controlled presence. This is being handled as part of an ongoing investigation. The voice said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, leaving no ambiguity, and Hayes listened, really listened this time, not for weakness, not for opportunity, but for understanding, because there was no longer anything else to look for, no advantage to find, no angle to exploit, just the reality of the moment, clear and unavoidable. Angela took a slow breath, her gaze steady as she spoke once more, her voice unchanged, but now carrying the final thread that tied everything together. Every stop you made, every interaction, every choice, she said quietly, it all led here. And those words did not accuse, they did not condemn. They simply acknowledged what had already become evident, and Hayes felt them settle in a way that could not be dismissed, could not be argued away, because for the first time, he saw the pattern not as something distant, not as something abstract, but as something real, something that had shape and consequence and direction, something that had been moving toward this exact point all along. And as he stood there, no longer the one in control, no longer the one directing the moment, Daniel Hayes understood something that had never been clear to him before, that power without accountability is not control, it is delay, and delay always ends the same way, with the truth arriving, patient and unyielding, exactly when it is meant to. The highway had never felt this quiet before, not because there was no sound, but because every sound now carried meaning, the soft hum of engines idling, the faint crunch of gravel under measured footsteps, the distant wind brushing across miles of open land, all of it forming a backdrop that no longer belonged to chance, but to something deliberate, something controlled in a way Daniel Hayes had never truly understood until this moment. He stood there no longer as the center of the scene but as part of it, a shift so subtle in motion, yet so complete in meaning that it left no room for denial. The flashing lights behind him continued their steady rhythm, but they no longer felt like an extension of him. They had become something else, a signal marking the end of a pattern that had once gone unchecked. The individuals surrounding the scene moved with quiet coordination, their presence not overwhelming but undeniable. Each position held with purpose, each glance intentional, and Hayes felt it clearly now, the difference between control and structure, between authority taken and authority assigned. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in surrender, not in defeat, but in recognition. The kind that comes when resistance no longer serves a purpose, when the path forward is no longer shaped by choice, but by consequence. Angela Brooks remained steady, her gaze fixed not in confrontation but in clarity, as if this moment was not about proving something but about revealing what had already been true. There were over 40 recorded stops linked to this stretch of road, she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the quiet without needing to rise. Each one followed the same pattern. And Hayes listened, not because he wanted to argue, not because he was searching for a way out, but because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to reshape. The words were no longer something he could deflect, they were something he had to face. Time of night, isolated location, selective targeting. She continued, each detail precise, measured, like lines drawn across a map that led directly to him. No official citations filed, no documentation entered. And as she spoke, the weight of those omissions settled heavier than any accusation, because absence, when repeated, becomes its own kind of evidence. Hayes closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to process, to gather what remained of the control he once held and understand what it meant now. And when he opened them again, the scene had not changed, because it was not meant to. It had already reached its final shape. One of the figures stepped slightly forward, holding a tablet, its screen casting a faint glow that cut through the darkness. You have the right to review the documentation, the voice said, even, professional, offering not a challenge but a process, and Hayes looked at it, not immediately reaching, not immediately responding, because the concept of process itself felt foreign in this context, unfamiliar in a space where things had always been handled informally, quietly, without record. But now everything was record, everything was visible, everything was preserved. Angela shifted her stance slightly, not stepping away, not stepping closer, simply aligning herself with the moment as it unfolded. This is not about one decision, she said, her tone unchanged, but her words carrying deeper weight now. It is about a pattern that continued because no one interrupted it. And those words did not accuse him directly, they did not need to, because the pattern spoke for itself, and Hayes felt that truth settle in a way that could not be undone. He had always believed that control came from being the only one in the moment, the only voice, the only authority, but now he understood that real control was never his to begin with. It had only existed in the absence of accountability, and now that absence was gone, replaced by structure, by oversight, by something that did not disappear when the night ended. The wind moved again across the open land, carrying with it the faint sound of distant traffic far beyond the scene, a reminder that the world continued beyond this moment, beyond this road. But for Hayes, everything had narrowed to this single point in time. This realization that what had once been routine was now record, what had once been ignored was now documented, and what had once felt permanent was now ending. Angela looked at him one last time, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a calm acknowledgement of what this moment represented, not just for him, but for everyone who had passed through this highway before him, unseen, unheard, until now. And as the lights continued to flash against the vast Texas night, illuminating a scene that could no longer be hidden, Daniel Hayes understood something with a clarity he had never known before, that the road does not belong to the one who stands on it the longest. It belongs to the truth that eventually reaches it. The scene did not end with a sudden shift or a dramatic moment. It settled, slowly and inevitably, like dust returning to the ground after a long disturbance. And Daniel Hayes stood there in the middle of it, no longer resisting, no longer searching for a way to reshape what had already taken form around him, because there was nothing left to reshape. The night had moved past that point, the structure surrounding him now complete, steady, unbroken. The voices around him remained calm, professional, each instruction given with clarity, each step unfolding without urgency, but without pause. And Hayes followed, not out of force, not out of fear, but because the direction of the moment was no longer his to determine. The gravel shifted softly beneath his boots as he stepped away from the position he had once occupied so confidently, the place beside the patrol car that had defined his presence on this road for years. And as he moved, that space remained behind him, unchanged yet, no longer his. a silent marker of something that had ended without needing to announce itself. Angela Brooks watched quietly, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not relieved, but grounded in a calm understanding of what this moment represented, not a victory, not a confrontation, but a correction, the kind that does not arrive loudly but carries weight far beyond its volume. The tablet was placed in front of Hayes, its screen illuminated with records, timestamps, coordinates, each entry precise, each detail aligned, forming a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or isolated behavior. And as he looked at it, really looked this time, he saw it clearly, not as a list of moments he could explain away, but as a sequence that told a story he had never allowed himself to hear. Each stop connected, each decision recorded, each absence of documentation now standing as evidence in its own right. And for the first time, he understood that the silence he had relied on for so long had not erased those moments. It had only delayed their return. The individuals around him maintained their positions, their presence steady, their focus clear, not on controlling him, but on completing the process that had been set in motion long before this night. Angela stepped slightly closer, her voice soft but certain. "This is where accountability begins," she said, and the words did not accuse, they did not condemn, they defined. They marked a transition from what had been hidden to what was now visible, from what had been assumed to what was now proven, and Hayes felt them settle with a clarity that did not require explanation. He nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question, nothing left to deny. The highway stretched out behind them, still, vast, still open, but no longer empty in the way it had once been. It carried memory now. It carried record. It carried the weight of everything that had happened along it. And as the lights continued to flash against the dark Texas sky, illuminating a scene that had shifted from routine to revelation, Angela turned her gaze briefly toward the road, then back to him, her voice steady as she spoke one final time. "You believed no one was watching," she said, not as a challenge, but as a simple truth. But the truth does not need an audience to exist. And those words lingered in the air, not because they were loud, but because they were final. And as the process continued around him, calm and measured, Daniel Hayes stood on the side of that highway and understood something that had never been clear before. That power built on silence does not disappear quietly. It ends the moment the truth decides to speak, and when it does, it does not ask for permission. It simply arrives, patient, undeniable, and complete.